Right. So we'll start with World Trade Organization. In the previous class, I gave a brief introduction to what is the World Trade Organization and its role, right? So we discussed the brief history in the previous class. So I told you WTO replaced GATT, right? So General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. So if you just recollect, so since 1947, the GATT's agreement was regulating the international trade. So with the development of communication and transportation, there was a need for another organization, or rather an institutional mechanism to deal with international trade. So GATT was simply an agreement, okay, whereas WTO is an institution. So under the institution, member countries can negotiate trade related agreements. Are you understanding? So what is WTO? WTO is a framework within which member countries can negotiate anything related to trade. Second, it also has dispute resolution mechanism. It also has mechanism to enforce these agreements. In case if there is any deviation from the agreement by the members can go to WTO, okay, and get their redressal. Okay, if China has done something against the agreement with India, India can go to WTO against China. Okay, and the scope also is wider, whereas GATT dealt only with your tariffs and goods, whereas WTO, the scope is wider. It deals with services, it deals with intellectual property rights, it deals with investments. So anything associated with trade can be dealt under WTO. So why WTO? Okay, so the reason why WTO was introduced was it was an institution. GATT was an agreement. So with the growth of trade as a result of improvement in transportation and communication, we required an institutional mechanism where the scope would be wide. You have a grievance redressal mechanism, dispute settlement. It also scope was wider. Services, intellectual property rights, investments, all of them are dealt under under WTO. All right, and also dealt with non-tariff barriers. So in the previous class, we discussed barriers can be of two types, tariffs and non-tariff barriers. So WTO also deals with non-tariff barriers. Right. So what is the functions of WTO? Very quickly, if we have to go through the functions of World Trade Organization. So forum for trade negotiation. As I told you, WTO provides a framework within which trade negotiation takes place. Anything, see in the future, we are going to discuss about e-commerce that is happening now. Okay, so any aspect of trade negotiation can take place within WTO because it provides a framework. Okay, it removes trade barriers. So whether it is tariff and non-tariff barriers are removed. So in our discussion, I told you there are two types of barriers, tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers. So non-tariff barriers are not good for trade because it is unpredictable and it is biased. Tariff, okay, is predictable because tariff limits are fixed and member countries cannot levy taxes beyond a level. So therefore, for a trader, if I am an exporter to another country, I know what is the maximum tax that I have to pay. So it makes it predictable. Whereas non-tariff barriers is non-predictable. Okay, embargo can be levied anytime. Yes, the sanctions can be levied anytime. Okay, restrictions can be levied anytime. So therefore, which one is better, tariff or non-tariff? If at all any barrier is required, which is better? Tariff barriers are better. So WTO aims at eliminating non-tariff barriers and reducing tariff barriers. Did you understand? So the WTO aims at reducing your tariff barriers and eliminating what? Non-tariff barriers. Because it's not good for trade. Ultimately, World Trade Organization wants to do what? It wants to promote open, free, transparent, predictable, rule-based trade. Alva. So WTO aims at promoting transparent, open, rule-based, predictable trade. How can we achieve it? By reducing tariffs and eliminating non-tariff barriers. Then it also administers WTO agreements. It also facilitates settlement of trade-related disputes. So it has got it has got trade dispute board within WTO. There is a board which deals with resolving trade disputes, whether it is between India, China, whether it is India, US. For example, we had a certain problem with US with respect to our solar panels. Okay, US went to the WTO against India and India lost. I'll explain to you later about it. So trade related disputes, it also helps in cooperation. Okay, also has mechanism to review trade policies. It has mechanism to review trade policy of every member country and see whether it is violating WTO rules. Okay, so for developing nations, it has to be reviewed once every 4 years. Okay, and for developed nation, once every 2 years, it is reviewed. And they will check whether the trade policies are violating WTO norms or not. If it is violating, they will say that you change it immediately. Then it also provides consultancy services, especially to the developing and least developed nations, and also collects trade-related data using which the various stakeholders in trade will be able to address trade-related issues. Is that understood, all of you? So these are some basic functions of World Trade Organization. Okay, so for that purpose, GATS was replaced with WTO, and these are the functions performed by WTO. A general understanding of it, World Trade Organization. So today, World Trade Organization is responsible for a rule-based, open, transparent, predictable trade regime in our world. Now, before we go into the agreements, etc. So in this discussion on WTO, what are the things that we have to know is, one is that agreements relating to trade, some of the important ones, and the underlying principles on the basis of which these agreements are signed. Okay, and the basic organizational structure of WTO and some current events relating to the same. So before we go into the agreements, we'll try to understand some other basic information about WTO. So now WTO has members, and these members are grouped into developed and developing countries. Okay, so the members of WTO are grouped into developed and developing nations. There is no definition by WTO to define who is developed and who is developing. So in your exam, if they ask a question, is it by WTO rules? No. So it is based on self-selection. Every country has a choice to declare themselves developed or developing nation. Okay, so it is based on self-selection, and the other members have the right to question it. When it is questioned, then the things can change. Otherwise, it's based on self-selection. Keep that in mind. Within that developing nation, there are countries who are designated as least developed countries. Least developed countries. Okay, so there are 46 least developed countries, LDCs, Afghan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal is examples. In Africa, Guinea, Somalia and all are examples of least developed countries. So this list of least developed countries, LDCs, are listed in United Nations organization. So one of the organization called as United Nations Economic and Social Council. It is one of the body of UN, a specialized body of UN, which deals with socio-economic development of the poor nations. So they have maintained a list called as what? LDCs. Now, why this difference is because they have the agreements are differently applied. You understood? So there is differential treatment of members. Not all members are treated equal. They are differentially treated. Developed nations and developing nations are treated differently. Okay, developing nations has more flexibilities, more relaxed rules for implementing these agreements, and LDCs have been given preferential treatment. LDCs are given preferential treatment because trade can be a facilitator in development. Agreed, all of you? Trade can bring about economic growth, development, etc., employment. So trade can be used for developing a nation. So therefore, to facilitate the LDCs, to provide them preferential treatment, under the agreement, there are relaxed rules for them. I'll repeat again, members are divided into developed and developing nation. Within the developing nation, there are countries which are designated as LDCs who get preferential treatment. You'll understand when we discuss. So for you to just appreciate it right now, this is how the groups are classified, or rather the members are classified. So now getting back to our WTO agreement. So as I told you, WTO provides a framework. Members will come, meet, negotiate, and come up with agreements. Alva. So is it legally binding? Is this agreement legally binding? Yes, that's why there is redressal mechanism. Is it legally binding? Yes. They are legally binding agreements. That means once the agreement comes into force, every member has to abide by it. If they don't abide by it, that's what I told you, no, they will drag them to the dispute resolution mechanism of WTO. We'll come to that later. So if, say, as I told you, US dragged India to WTO, saying that we violated a rule. I have to tell you all that. Then only what is the rule? So I've kept it for the later discussion. So what is that rule? Solar panel dispute. So US dragged India because we violated that agreement. When will it be abiding with legally binding? Then, is it differently applicable? Yes. Developed and developing nations. So they have responsibilities, but differently implemented. Okay. So is it differently applicable? Yes. So developing nations are given more flexibility. They are given more time to implement these agreements. Is it absolute? Is it absolute? No, it's not absolute. There are circumstances where member countries can deviate from the agreement in order to protect health, environment, and their industry or whatever sector, economy, or to protect their economy. Members are allowed to deviate. So those deviations are also mentioned in WTO. Okay, these times you can deviate to protect the health, to protect the environment. You remember when I put the slide that time, mangoes, bagging. So phytosanitary measures. So you are exporting fruits, and if that fruit is having disease in it, don't you think they have the right to prevent that fruit entering into their market? You cannot say, oh, it's open trade, don't do anything. Can we do that? No, there are certain restrictions that are allowed to protect what? Health, environment, and the economy, like from cheap import, like dumping. Alva. So dumping, is it good for the economy? It is going to affect our domestic economy. So we can levy what? Anti-dumping duty. So this is provided within WTO. If somebody is practicing unfair trade practice, we can reciprocate by putting restrictions. Okay, now is it absolute? No. Under certain circumstances, we can levy trade barriers. So there are around 60 agreements that have been signed under WTO. Some of them we will discuss a little bit in detail. Okay, like GATT, I told you, has been now subsumed under WTO. Then we have trade-related investment measures. Okay, GATT's General Agreement on Trade in Services, TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property rights. We'll do this. We'll do all of them one by one. Is that understood?